Good evening. For today's video, I would like to demonstrate two different watchmakers and to show how these differ and how we are most certainly dealing with two different individuals altogether. And this is of importance as several of these watches can be seen regularly appearing on auctions, sales, eBay, etc. And these watches tend to be, well, they are extremely rare, as are all Montandon watch pieces. However, these pieces in general tend to be confusing in that the individuals behind them are not very well understood widely, and therefore I think it is quite important to explain who these individuals were and the difference between these. Now, that we do have, and I will be providing close-ups of these pieces for our analysis. We do have, in general, watches, and these generally tend to be open-face watches. These are earlier, these precede the other watches that we will be discussing. However, these watches are always signed Louis Montandon, Geneva. And we are generally talking about the period between 1840 to 1860, where these watches are materializing. That is the date of these watches now, 1840 to 1860. And we do have an individual who matches this in Davoine almanacs. Now, let us just briefly look, and I will provide the close-ups, but in general, Louis Montandon did not sign his dial. We do find on the dust cover a signature, Louis Montandon, Geneva, sometimes Genève. And we do also have some Louis Montandon, Locle de Fond. But in relationship to the almanac listings, we do have a Louis Montandon that was in Locle de Fond, and he was predominantly at two different sites. His last site was at Saint Pierre, number 20, and he is identified as a fabricant de horlogerie. So this is an individual who's manufacturing watches, and this tends to be the individual who puts his name on a watch. But he was very early in these Davoine almanacs, and this individual is Louis Auguste Montandon, and he was born, I believe, in 1806 and died in 1880. Now, his son would also be in watchmaking, and he would be making watches under the name of Henry Montandon, and this is most probably Henry Locle de Fond. We do have three signed pieces that we know of, but Louis himself, Louis Auguste, he appears to have been listed in Davoine almanacs for watchmaking up until 1873 to 1874, and after that we don't see him listed anymore. Now, his son Charles Henry was under the name of Henry, and he was manufacturing up until about 1870, and then it appears that he went into government service and is no longer in the watch business. Now, the other individual, and these, we do have a very good case for the reason that these are two different individuals. Now, this is a L. Montandon Locle signed piece. Now, these pieces tend to be a little bit later, basically from the mid to late 1860s up until approximately 1880. And these pieces are always signed L. Montandon Locle, never L. Montandon Geneva, but L. Montandon Locle. And this is this later period, this approximately a generation, 15 to 20 years after the Louis Montandon Genevas. So therefore, we are most certainly dealing with two different individuals. Now, this individual, we do have a Louis Frederic Montandon, and he was in Les Brenets originally, and he appears to have sustained a bankruptcy by the end of the 1860s. However, or the mid 1860s. However, he did rematerialize in Locle on Rue de la Côte, and he seems to have been producing alongside and probably with Montandon for his Locle. And it is very probable that he was signing pieces, that he was, this was a side business for him, even though he was probably fulfilling in general tasks for Montandon for his Locle. He seems to have been part of their organization. He was probably also earning on the side with his own pieces. And after this period, we're not seeing these El Montandon Locle pieces anymore. Now later in the 1890s, there would be a Louis Montandon in La Chaux-de-Fonds, and this was actually the grandson of Louis Auguste, who was originally signing in Geneva from La Chaux-de-Fonds. So we do have these very close individuals. They're all very closely related. These are cousins, and indeed Louis Auguste did come from the Traverse Valley area, and like Louis Frederick, who also came from this area. So they were close cousins. But let us look at these two pieces. Let us examine them and compare and contrast them. And I hope it is interesting. I hope this gives watch owners of some of these pieces a little bit of background. This is rather fascinating, but I do want to show the differences between these two makers, and I hope you enjoy, so let us proceed. So I would like to begin this analysis of these pieces with the disclaimer that naturally now we have these two, most certainly these are two different individuals, because clearly we have an individual who is only signing in this fashion with Geneva as Louis Montandon. I do believe that this individual must have been more locally famous, and indeed this would be another reason that this would point towards Louis Auguste Montandon, who was very active in the Republican government, especially since the 1848 events, and he was part of the provisional government, and so he was very well known locally. And I think that this is another reason, and he is also listed in Devon almanacs as Louis Montandon, whereas the other individual, Louis Frederick, he is listed in Devon almanacs as Montandon LF, and later Louis Frederick, and he was Montandon Humbert, and that was Humbert was his allied family name. His wife was a Humbert, and it is probably more likely that he would have gone by simply Ill, not Montandon. Now, but it must be admitted that this naturally could be totally the other way around, and that Louis Frederick would have been making the watches signed Louis Montandon Geneva. However, I can consider this much less likely. And then there is also the timing that in general, Louis Montandon was establishing watches much earlier in the 1840s. However, LF Montandon is Louis Frederick, and I believe he was born in 1816, and he died in 1882, I believe. But he was actually in the watch business in Le Brenet from 1846. Now, he started as a remonteur, and this was a person who was essentially repairing watches. And this is already in 1846. And several years later, we already see him simply mentioned as horloger. This is merely a watchmaker. This is a very general term. But certainly within the 1850s, and we're talking about the early to mid-1850s, we already start to find him mentioned, and I believe this is at least by 1853, but around in this period, as a fabricant or négociant horlogerie. So this is already an individual who is putting his name on the watches. Yet, certainly, Louis would have had the capital, and he was definitely appears to have been much more wealthy earlier, and certainly more established. Now, these pieces are very interesting. It must be stated that these pieces signed Louis Montandon Geneva are much less frequent. Indeed, there are only about half as many recorded examples of these, where we have El Montandon Locle pieces in the 20s, at least 22 such pieces, I believe. There's only around 11 or so of these Louis Montandon Geneva pieces which have been documented. Now, those pieces assigned Louis Montandon are almost usually, not all the time, but almost always gold pieces. There are watches, pocket watches made of gold. However, there are 2 documented silver pieces, and indeed we do have 3 other pieces signed La Chaux de Fonds. And of these are the 1850 to 1870 period. One is Louis Montandon La Chaux de Fonds, whereas the other 2 are L. Montandon La Chaux de Fonds. And this is quite interesting. This is a gray area that technically these could go to either of these 2 individuals. However, I tend to think that these are probably part of the Louis Auguste pieces, and indeed there would be very little reason, I believe, that Louis Frederick would be signing from Le Brenet as La Chaux de Fonds. It's possible, it is plausible, but it is less likely than that he would be going for the Locle designation, which was that's general sign of quality that was applied. Now, Geneva also was that this was a quality assignation. However, La Chaux de Fonds, it most certainly would have designated physical presence in the city, and we do not find Louis Frederick in these pieces. And the fact that we do have a Louis Montandon La Chaux de Fonds, this is also brings us back to, I believe, Louis Auguste for these pieces. Now, also, these watches do follow entirely different watch serialization tendencies. Now, the pieces that are signed Louis Montandon Geneva, these pieces are generally up before the early 20,000s. We're talking 1800 or 18,000, 17,000, 15,000, 11,000, basically from 11,000 up until I think the highest is 25,528. So up to 25,000. Now, very interestingly, L. Montandon Locle sign pieces are generally higher than these, but they are the lowest of these, I believe, is 33,000, and they generally are in this period is 33,000, 44,000, etc., 66. They're in this range, but now what we do see in these pieces that are L. Montandon Locle, and these are more significant in number, almost double the amount have been documented. There are a tendency for these pieces to, they're much more 1860s, 1870s, right up till 1880. And there is a commonality here that in these pieces that we do not find in the Louis Montandon Geneva pieces, and that is there are a tendency for these to have Jules Jurgensen style movements, but there are also Lepine 5 movements in these watches, but there is a tendency for these varieties of Jules Jurgensen style movements, and that is also a telltale sign. Whereas we know that Louis Frederick Montandon had already moved to the Locle area by around 1868. We find him in Devlin Almanacs. He appears to be right in the midst of Montandon Furs watch fabrication, and indeed Montandon Furs did also employ a lot of these Jules Jurgensen style movements. So this is a very big hint. If he was working in collaboration with them, he would have very possibly had access to their suppliers, and he may have been able to sign pieces as part of the brand with his name and earning extra money. This is definitely where this seems to be going. Now, the Louis Montandon Geneva pieces, they have these more Lepine 4 and 5 style, but they're definitely earlier pieces, and they are fine pieces. And one of the reasons why they're probably fewer in variety is they tend to be more in the golden spectrum, whereas L. Montandon Locle, we have a high concentration of silver pieces. Now, there are gold watches, but these are infrequent compared to the situation with Louis Montandon Geneva pieces. So we do have these differentiations. Now, I would like to point out that the watch that I did have in the at the beginning of the video, now this is most clearly, this is an L. Montandon movement, and it is not, it is clear that this piece was not native to the case. The case was sourced later, and we know that this has to be the reason, or the case, because the keyholes do not align properly. That in general, the watch stem, or the pendant rather, the pendant should be at either 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock. Now this falls to 11 o'clock, which cannot be correct, and there is almost a millimeter difference, so that the movement slides. It is not nestled in properly, and this is most clearly a later collector's attempt to assemble a watch, and this was the best case that could be sourced, clearly, and the case has also nothing to do with this watchmaker, or clearly the supplier is used by this watchmaker, so we do have this. But I did want to point out these compare and contrast these two different watchmakers and the styles of these watches. Now, one other fine point is with Louis Montandon Geneva pieces. I'm totally certain to assert that we never find him signing the dials, and he likewise does not sign the movements. He only has a signature on the dust cover. Now, these L. Montandon Locle pieces, they in general do have a signed movement as well as a signed dial, and they also have the signed dust cover. So we have, in general, we have at most 3 signed locations on these pieces. But this is a big difference, and this also is one way of determining that we have 2 different watchmakers, because they would have been, they were, of course, making these watches, establishing them in many of these cases. Louis Auguste was probably early on making these watches himself. However, I think, as his age increased and he got older, I think he tended to depend more wholly upon subcontractors and suppliers to fabricate these watches for him, so that he was less and less involved, and he was more of an owner than an actual watchmaker. Now, he may have been overseeing the actual watch fabrication, that cannot be excluded, but he was also involved in a lot of governmental activities, and he had roles to play in these, and I believe he was even some kind of appellate judge at one point. So we do see this, but we do have these very interesting cases, and I did want to show the difference between these 2 individuals and these 2 watch styles. But clearly we have these 2 individuals, and I hope that this was an informative video. Now, I would like to continue this video. We do have a very interesting court case that was found from the documents of the appellate court of the canton of Neuchâtel, in particular the La Chaux-de-Fonds court, and this most certainly relates to our first Louis, the one who was probably signing Louis Montandon Geneva. We do have this case between Louis Montandon of La Chaux-de-Fonds and a Julien Perret, and also of the same city, and they appear to have had some kind of partnership in between May and October of 1868. And I would like to make a follow-up video to this video with regards to that legal matter. This is rather interesting. I would like to share this. The court did find in favor of Louis Montandon, who was the defendant, But it is an interesting case, and I would like to bring this as a follow-up video. But that is Louis Montandon versus L. Montandon. We have Geneva and Locle. These are two different makers, and I hope this was of use. I hope someone that has a similar piece reaches out to me with information about their watches. It's very interesting to get the feedback from you. And if anyone has an extremely rare Louis Montandon Geneva piece, this would be a real pleasure to hear from you and to see any kind of photographs from your timepieces. But thank you for your comments as always, and I wish you a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.